Welcome to Chapter 1. The chapter begins with asking the question, what is American history and identity? America includes people who have come from different places and different backgrounds. America devolved on the northern continent of the hemisphere, where we see many European empires vying for power, that of the French, the Spanish, the English, and before these Europeans arrived, we know that the first people to have arrived in North America was that of the Native Americans. This map is also included in your textbook, and it's displaying the time before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. We know that 14,000 years ago, indigenous people crossed the Bering Strait, which was a natural land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. And if hopefully this works, my pointer up here shows that natural land bridge right here where the Arctic Ocean is located. That's where the land bridge was. We know that by the 15th century, approximately 7 to 12 million of these Native Americans farmed, fished, hunted, and also gathered the food. This map shows us, and I want to point out in particular, to the northeast, and especially, so here we have the northeast, and especially the southwest. Those areas were places of agriculture. Native American women, and I'm using this generalization, were in charge of horticulture, meaning that they were in charge of garden cultivation, the most popular being corn and other sorts of crops. The men, in general, were in charge of the hunter-gatherer, meaning that they were hunting the animal and they were bringing it back to the home. In general, Native American women lived with their husbands and their families, or vice versa. So the husband would stay with his wife and her family, or vice versa. I want to emphasize the next point, and that is Native American women differed in their degree of status and autonomy, and their position also related to their responsibility with the economy. Native American economy was based upon trading different goods like shells, furs, pottery, special things that were made to wear around the neck. Trade, for the most part, was peaceful, but over time we know that there was a lot of war that occurred over land and resources, especially with the colonists that arrived in North America. We will spend a little bit more time on that later on in the PowerPoint slides. The Iroquois Confederacy was composed of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk tribes located in New York and Canada. Well, what exactly was the Iroquois Confederacy, and why was it established? It was established in 1451. The purpose of it was for peace, and it was led by the women, the Native American women. In fact, the Native American women, these Iroquois women, had so much power that they had the power to choose men to lead the battles, and they also had the power to depose men. So Iroquois women were special in that way. The Iroquois women lived in longhouses, which were made of large bark and log. The longhouse was a residential housing where all of the Iroquois women would live, and they would go ahead and raise crops like corn, squash, beans. They also gathered the nuts and berries and prepared food for each other. And so, in that sense, they really had this camaraderie that maybe some other Native American tribes did not have. When it came to religion, these Iroquois women were especially important because they were seen as interpreter of dreams. They would listen to people's dreams and then interpret the meaning of it. And they also led the special rituals when someone would die, and other special rituals that were very important for the Iroquois. As of war, when it came to war, Iroquois women planned the attacks. They planned revenge for deaths that were taken upon their people. They were in charge of provisioning warriors. They were in charge of hiring the soldiers and even men to lead the battle if that was necessary. So the fact that the Iroquois women led all of the different aspects of the battle, of the warriors, of the leader of the battles, that was pretty important and pretty unique. So just to further exemplify how important these Iroquois women were and how different they were from other Native American tribes, we have this European observation. And so the quote goes, "In order to expedite their business and at the same time enjoy each other's company, they all worked together in one field or at whatever job they may have on hand. They chose an older woman to be their driver and overseer and went at labor for the ensuing year. She accepts the honor and they consider themselves bound to her." So if we interpret this, we would say that this observation, now this is an outsider coming from a totally different background, a totally different culture, observing the Iroquois women. She notices that they have this kinship with one another. They look up to one another and they praise each other. It's like a sisterhood. We have this second European observation of Iroquois women. This time it's coming from a priest. And the quote goes, "Nothing, however, is more real than this superiority of the women. The land, the fields, and their harvest all belong to them. They are all the souls of the councils, the arbiters of peace and of war. They have charge of the public treasury. To them are given the slaves. They arrange the marriages. The children are their domain, and it is through their blood that the order of succession is transmitted." Wow, right? That's pretty heavy. That's a huge responsibility that is given to the Iroquois women. So before I give you a little bit of an insight as to what their responsibility was, but here we see even more responsibilities. They're in charge of the economic aspects of the money. They are given slaves after war. They arrange marriages. So this is really, really like unique for that time period. And I know in the lecture I'm not being specific maybe about the other tribal women, but after you read the chapter, think about, wow, what is the difference? Okay, they weren't just the wives, they weren't just gathering nuts, they weren't just in charge of the crops, they were taking on these huge, powerful roles. So we started the lecture talking about Europeans and and their conquering of people, and that's a huge theme throughout this chapter and this PowerPoint lecture. So let's go back and let's just start with the basics. Why did these Europeans explore? Well, we're focusing, when I say the Europeans explore and they're sailing and they're conquering and whatnot, we're focusing more so on the 15th century, so the 1400s. Okay, when I teach my world history class, my Western Civ classes, there's just a whole lecture just about why they explored. But when it comes to the historical aspects, I try to break it down a little bit more and just make it a little bit more simplistic. So there's a multitude of reasons why Europeans explored. And I'm sure that you have some sort of background knowledge on this as well. So it dealt with technology. There was new technology that was being made. For example, the ship known as the caravel allowed explorers to sail quicker, faster, navigate that much better. Why else did they explore? Curiosity. What was out there? They wanted to know. You know, today in our world, we can know right now, going on the internet, what's going on over in, I don't know, pick a place, England. What's the news going on over there? We can hop on an airplane if we got the money and the time, and we can go over to Spain if we want. Okay, so we live in a very modern world where technology, the use of airplanes, the use of, traveling, it's not a big deal to us. So you're rolling your eyes like, what do you mean curiosity? Put yourselves back centuries ago, okay? They had no knowledge whatsoever of what was out there. They didn't even have appropriate maps like we do today. So there was a curiosity of, where are these places? What are the people like? Another reason to explore was to conquer. I'm going to go out there to this new world, to this new land, to conquer the people and have more power for my country, my people. And then also you could go on and talk about the greed of it. Another big reason, which you will see as we go through the lecture, was not just this domination, but there was a spiritual aspect to it, the religious aspect to it, to convert these people. It was like a spiritual call. Okay, so with that said, I've broken up the following slides into the Portuguese explorers or explorer and then the Spanish. Now, the purpose of it is, you'd say to yourself, well, wait a second, there are a lot of explorers. Of course there were a lot. Like Magellan and Christopher Columbus, and the list goes on. But I've chosen for our lecture to focus on some of these other explorers for a purpose, and you'll see that as we go on. So in the map below, you'll see, and you can expand this, you can manipulate the PowerPoint as you want, but there's this competition between the Portuguese and the and the Spanish in the 15th century to dominate and conquer the continent. The continent. So, was it just the Portuguese? Was it just the Spanish? No. We know you got the French, you've got the English as well, you've got I already said Spanish, you've got the Dutch, the list goes on of these Europeans. So sailing for the Portuguese, we know Prince Henry the Navigator was one of the most famous, and I'm going to talk about him in the next slide. Sailing for the Spanish, I selected to talk about Hernan Cortez, as well as the other Spanish conquistador, Coronado. So let's move on to our next slide and talk about Prince Henry. Prince Henry the Navigator, Long story short, he was of royal background. Yes, he had explored to Africa when he was a child because his father was fascinated with Africa, and so was he. He was fascinated by the culture, the different culture, and the area and what it was like. And so when he was king, he gathered all of his resources, the ships, the men, the provisions, everything he would need to explore to West Africa. And so Prince Henry the Navigator, who was this Portuguese royalty, landed in West Africa, and he is noted, please take note of this, he is noted as having been the first to begin the slave trade. Later, at the end of our PowerPoint slide, we're going to get back to that whole African slave trade and the Europeans, but please keep this in mind. There is a lot about Hernan Cortez. When he was a teenager, his family thought that he was mischievous. Growing up, people felt that he was a little shady. And so it was the governor of Cuba that appointed this nobleman, Hernan Cortez, to undertake the effort of exploring to reach the Aztec Empire in central Mexico. Cortez was given the funding, the men, the ships, etc., to go exploring. He landed in Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, and there were a lot of things that happened that allowed him to take over. So first of all, he was able to align with subject peoples that resented the Aztecs that ruled over them because they were forced to pay tribute. Some of them were forced to be like slave laborers, and there were large-scale human sacrifices that were demanded by the Aztecs to feed into their religious belief. Now, why human sacrifice? The Aztecs had a very complicated religion, and part of the religion was the belief that the world would end without this sacrifice. So there were something called flower wars with other tribes that occurred, and when the other tribe failed to win the battle, the Aztecs would take the prisoners of war and sacrifice them. Now, there were other ways to get people to be human sacrifices. Some thought it was an honor and volunteered their own life. Others were prisoners of war. Some fathers paid cacao beans for their daughters to be human sacrifices. Yeah, gee, thanks, Dad. So the list goes on. But the point is that one factor that allowed Cortez to conquer the Aztecs was the aid of subject peoples. Now, I put religion here, okay? So, in two senses, religion and gods, in two ways. King Moctezuma II of the Aztec people and the Aztecs had their belief system. And they believed that, according to Hernan Cortez, he wrote back to the Spanish to tell them that Moctezuma and the Aztecs believed that he was a god. He's sailing on water, you know. They didn't know about this technology, Cortez said, and Cortez and his men were dressed much differently than the indigenous people in modern-day Mexico City, so they even looked to them like gods, according to Cortez. Now, scholars today debate whether or not Moctezuma actually thought Cortez was a god, but that's what Cortez wrote to the Spanish when he was able to conquer the Aztecs. Cortez brought the Christian religion. So we're seeing a theme here as you go along of extending the Christian religion once these European conquerors do conquer these native lands. Disease was brought with Hernan Cortez, which helped to decimate the population. He was given a bunch of slave women. One of them he took in. He renamed her Dona Marina. Her name, tribal name, was Malinche, and she acted as an interpreter on the behalf of Cortez, which helped him to communicate and dealt out his plans to take over Tenochtitlan and this region of modern-day Mexico City. He had better weaponry, okay? You know, the Aztecs had flower wars, so not these technologically advanced weaponries like muskets, for example, they did not have. Okay, so this gives us a little bit of an idea. He kidnapped Moctezuma, and he was holding him in his possession until one of the Spanish, it is believed, actually killed Moctezuma. Cortez, long story short, because of all of these things that were on his side, was able to Christianize this area of modern-day Mexico City and take over the Aztecs in the name of the Spanish Empire. And just to go back for a second, I told you that the Cuban governor funded his voyage. Just to be clear, Cuba in the 16th century was a province of the Spanish Empire. So, Spanish Cuba. Dona Marina, her native name Malinche. So down here I have a picture of Malinche or Dona Marina interpreting on the behalf of Cortez to the king and the Aztec people. So let's see if I can show that with my pointer. Great. So there they are, and she's interpreting on the behalf of him. Dona Marina was actually enslaved and given to Hernan Cortez, and he used her as an interpreter, as I said before. She became his mistress and gave Cortez a son. So what's interesting is that Malinche or Dona Marina has been seen in different perspectives. So some saw her or see her as a traitor to the native people. Because here she is helping out Hernan Cortez. Others saw her as a victim. Did she really have a choice? What if she didn't interpret? What would have happened to her? But I've got this interesting poem that I want to read to you that was created, modern day poem. And it goes like this. I was not tricked. I was not screwed. I was not a traitor. I was not a traitor to myself. I saw a dream and I reached it. Another world, La Raza. And La Raza means race. So what can we make of that poem? That poem, I think if we interpret it, means that Dona Marina was a strong woman. She saw that, okay, I'm in this impossible situation. However, I'm going to seize upon this opportunity. She learned the Spanish language and she used her intellect so that she could have some sort of consequence in the world at her time. So what happened after Cortez left is the daughter of the Aztec, the ruler of the Aztecs' daughter was chosen by Cortez to be the ruler over her people. So he left her in place and gave her the Isabel Moctezuma. Isabel Isabel being the Christianized name. Her original name, which, I didn't include in the PowerPoint, was Tekupatsin. And so she was instructed to become a Christian and to convert, to be given the baptized name of Isabel. And in Cortez's view, she was a symbol of what he wished to portray as this rulership between the Aztecs and the Spanish. And furthermore, she was forced into an arranged marriage with a Spanish man. And so that's a little bit of tidbit of what happened after he left. So kind of like going with this theme of the Europeans arrive, we have the Spanish conquistador known as Vasquez de Coronado. This isn't something I'm going to test you on, but just so you know, he initially arrived in Florida in the year 1513. He was looking for some sort of treasure. He didn't find it. So he left Florida, he went to the Mississippi, then he eventually went to California and to Kansas. Okay, he was all over the place, long story short. But the natives that he came into contact with, he actually raped the women, him and his men, and demanded that all of the women be taken from their homes. And they were treated like they were nothing but animals. They were raped and they were enslaved. This was not something unique. A lot of European conquerors, did just the same. I also want to talk about Christian friars and how they dealt with Native women. The Christian friars were disgusted by what Coronado had done. And what they did was, they did come along the journey with the Europeans to Christianize the natives, to actually force them to convert to Christianity, because they felt that the Catholic religion, because the Christian friars and the priests felt that the Catholic religion was superior. In fact, the European conquerors thought that they were superior, that they were better, very Eurocentric type of point of view. And so Native women were promoted to take part in monogamy, to have more modest clothing. So let me go back. When we talk about monogamy, these Native women in their tribes were taken in as perhaps one of many. So the men would practice polygamy or would have more than one wife. The clothing was very minimal. And so the church changed all of this, forced them to convert, forced them to be more modern, to take on Christian names, to practice monogamy. So when the Europeans arrived, they found an importance with that of fish. Fish was very important to them, especially cod, C-O-D, cod, because it became a primary source of protein in the European diet. In fact, they found that the fish was easy to preserve, to transport, to purchase, and to prepare, especially during the time of war. So women became very important in the process and actually would help to sell the cod at the marketplace. They became known as fish wives. Later, they would be called foul-mouthed wives. Well, ha ha ha, right? Moving on, fur was also very important to the Europeans. It was seen as very fashionable, it was warm, it showed status, It was even used by the clergy. So fur was very important to the Europeans, and the European men would eventually interact with Native American women. The Native American women became important in this process because they were given the task of preparing the fur by scraping it, preparing the skin, and so on and so forth. And eventually, they were in charge of helping with the buying process. European men would actually marry the Native American woman as a part of the, I guess you could say, exchange process. Now we're going to change our focus to British settlements. So we've spent a lot of time, first we talked about the Portuguese and their settlements, then we talked about a lot about the Spanish and their settlements, and now I'm turning to the British. I'm focusing on Elizabeth I. Now, I want you to understand that in her time period, in the 16th century, a female ruling as a monarch was not always held in the highest of view, okay? It was still a man's world, and the fact that you would have a female monarch ruling over the kingdom was kind of like people grimaced, and I'm giving a generalization, of course. However, why did we have a female monarch? Well, because it was necessary. So let me explain. Henry VIII. Have you heard of Henry VIII? There's like this song from my mom's time about Henry VIII. I'm tempted to sing it. I'm not going to do it to you. I'm not going to hurt your ears. But there is a song about Henry VIII. Henry VIII had many wives. Does this sound familiar to you? Probably, hopefully. So Mary I was the only child of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Well, Mary I really was not supposed to be the monarch after her dad, Henry VIII, died. Long story short, she fought her way to the throne. So we're talking about Mary I. Mary I was a very, very Catholic queen. She loathed the Protestants. She loathed her half-sister Elizabeth because she was Protestant. So, with that said, the tension was very strong between the two. Mary I had married Philip II of Spain. Both ushered in this very militant Catholic time period. England had gone back and forth between the English religion and the Protestant religion. There was a lot of tension, a lot of warring between, those two religions, just to give you a little bit of an idea. Well, Mary had become very ill and had died, and therefore Elizabeth I came to power as monarch at a very young age. She was in her teenage years. Elizabeth was either loved or hated by some. She had been called out by the Pope as a bastard child because she had been born out of wedlock. Just to give you a little bit of an idea. So ruling as queen, you would think, oh, not such an easy thing, right? So Elizabeth really was a very strong, empowered woman. She spoke to her troops and gave them inspiration. And, I don't have the quote up there, but she told her men before going to battle, and that would be the battle here I have of the Spanish Armada against the Spanish in 1588. she actually told the men that she had the heart of a king. In other words, okay, she was a female, but she had the power to rule as a man. Okay. She also is known as the Virgin Queen. Was she a virgin? You know? She, when we say Virgin Queen, what we mean is she refused to marry any other monarch from any other nation, unlike her half-sister Mary I. She would not marry Philip II. Whoa, wait a second. Didn't I say before Philip II was actually the husband of her half-sister Mary? Yes, I did. So, just so you know. But she refused because she wanted to keep her nation as a Protestant nation. Philip II was a foreign monarch, was also the husband of her half-sister, and also he was Catholic. And she believed strongly in her faith, and she refused. She refused other suitors as well who were from different nations. She, again, as having a heart of a king, wanted to keep her nation strong, keep out foreign powers, keep out the Catholic influence, and to be solely ruler over her nation. And because of this, and because of tensions that were rising, the Spanish and the English went to war, and this is known as the Spanish Armada. Long story short, the English somehow, by this fortunate chance, win over the Spanish. So the English win during this time period, and it just goes to show what a very strong nation Elizabeth had created. And that she was able to send her men to battle with this positive vibe, and that they did win, just goes to show you, again, what a powerful nation that she was ruling over. Furthermore, after the time period of the defeat of the Spanish, Elizabeth I was laying claim to different settlements around the globe, including North America. So she sought to control the seas, to gain access to New World wealth, and to be an international powerhouse, just like the Spanish were doing, just like the Portuguese, just like the French, okay? So we have our initial British colonization in North America with the Roanoke colony led by the English colonist John White. Well, if you remember this from like US history and like high school or elementary school, you know that it didn't work out. The food, the necessities dwindled. There was no structure. And so John White left this experimental colonization. He went back to England. Later, he came back to the colony to find out that everyone had vanished. What happened? To this day, we don't know. But we do know that 20 years later, a new colony was being established, that of Jamestown. And that brings us to our next slide. Okay, so we just ended with, the Roanoke experiment didn't work out, so we have this Jamestown colony. And Jamestown was led by the English colonist John Smith. This brings us to our myths and legends. What do we know about John Smith and Pocahontas? What do you know about John Smith? Does this look familiar to you? Remember the cartoon version of John Smith? Young, hot, built, he's fit. Every woman's dream, right? Lucky Pocahontas. Well, guess what? If you look to the left of the screen, yep, sorry to ruin it for you. That's what he actually looked like. Not so hunky, right? So John Smith everything you knew about him maybe, is a little bit different. You also see this image that's in your book as well. You also see this image that's also in your book as well of John Smith. He's down here, and in his account to the English, he says that he was captured by the Native Americans and that he was going to be sacrificed. Look, they're going to kill him. Look how terrifying. There's a big fire in the background. He's going to be sacrificed as if he was an animal. But here, laying her hands around his waist, protecting him and saving his life, we have none other than Pocahontas. Well, that also is a myth, and I'll come back to that concept in a little bit. Pocahontas, here she is from the cartoon. Here she is. This was, oh my gosh, I got this a while ago from Disney put out some kind of ad with Jessica Biel, and Jessica Biel is supposed to be Pocahontas. Okay, she's there's a certain image of her. Well, this is actually sort of what she looked like down below. This is the real Pocahontas. Again, myths and legends. So let me now give you the lecture on John Smith. Okay, John Smith, he is the English colonist. He leads the colonists to Jamestown in Virginia to start the English colony. Okay, it's not easy. Not an easy time period. So John Smith had gone exploring in the year 1607, December of 1607. He went exploring along the Chickahominy River and was captured by a hunting party. He was brought back, and this was actually the tribe of Pocahontas. He was scared. He did fear for his life. But it turned out that John Smith did not have a negative encounter with the natives in the long run. They actually were kind to him. But we do see about maybe 9-10 years later that he writes this account that he was going to be sacrificed by these Native Americans. It was terrifying, it was scary, but the young girl Pocahontas saves his life. Well, it turns out that that really wasn't true. We believe that he made up this story to the English to actually enhance the image of Pocahontas to the English. John Smith was not the love interest of Pocahontas. They were actually good friends. And so later on, when Pocahontas was traveling to England, he wanted Pocahontas to be welcomed by the English. So again, there's another myth. John Smith was not this love interest of Pocahontas, but a friend. Now, Pocahontas was, it wasn't uncommon for Native American women to be given a couple of names. Another name she was given was Motoka. Later on, when she was married to John Rolfe, here I have below, she took on the Christianized name of Rebecca and was married to John Rolfe. John Rolfe was an English colonist. He did very well with raising tobacco. He married Pocahontas. He was 10 years older than her. She was, let's see here, I've got it. She was approximately 19. He was approximately 29 when they got married. And their marriage was seen as, or was almost like a peaceful alliance, because Pocahontas had been captured by the English during the time of warring between the English and her tribe. the English wanted to take over that region of Jamestown officially and call it theirs. And so her tribe battled with them, and they captured Pocahontas. Before this time period, Pocahontas had done a lot for the English. She had brought them food and provisions when they were in need of, when they were in need of food and provisions. She spent a lot of time with them. She was baptized as a Christian. It was even reported that she rebuked her own father and preferred to live with the English. And we know that she did marry John Rolfe, who was an Englishman. So she was captured. You know, was this a nice thing? No. Why would the English do this? Because not all of the English, there were certain Englishmen who were fighting this battle who hated her and her tribe. So, that was a difficult time for Pocahontas. What exactly happened to her during her captivity? No one is definitely sure, but it mustn't have been that bad because she did marry John Rolfe. And later, she was brought to England. She was welcomed by the English. She visited with John Smith. She even wore more of the English clothes. You can go back to that picture I showed before of what she looked like in her English clothes versus her tribal clothes. So she really kind of embraced this time period. And her marriage to John Rolfe led to an 8-year peace between her tribe and the English. So the view of Pocahontas by some was seen as, wow, she brought this peaceful time to our tribe. The war has stopped. But others viewed her as a traitor to her people. Why would that be? Go back into the lecture. Go back into your textbook and what I just said. So we've gone from Queen Elizabeth I, who was a very powerful monarch over England, in a time when being a powerful woman wasn't always seen as a great thing. We then talked about Pocahontas. She could be viewed again as very powerful for her time period, and the things that she did, some could argue. Now we have Queen Nzinga of Angola. Here I'm going to show you on the map, Angola in Africa, West Africa. Okay, and we're going to talk about her. But before we talk about her, we need to start with the Portuguese. Okay, going back to the concept of the Portuguese. The Portuguese were trying to establish their power, as we already know. And they did this by establishing their influence in West Africa. And this growing power of the Portuguese, the start of the slave trade, which we already talked about before, all was the time period in which Queen Nzinga lived. Now, Nzinga, in her tribe, it was prohibited for women to rule, believe it or not. Long story short, Nzinga was able to convince the Portuguese to support her bid to rise as queen. So she, in 1622, was baptized as a Christian, and she was able to rise as the ruler of Angola with the support of the Portuguese. She was very convincing to them. If you look down here, we have the Queen Nzinga, and she is talking to these Europeans. And do you see where she's sitting? Or who she's sitting on? She's actually sitting on a person. And she sat on this person as a symbol to show that she was powerful and to show that she had rulership over her people, and that it was not the Portuguese who had the rulership. But what's most noteworthy about Nzinga is that in 1641, she had aligned with the Dutch and went to battle against the Portuguese to win back her native land. In 1646, her army actually defeated the Portuguese. So just as Queen Elizabeth I was able to lead her people into battle successfully, the same was true of Queen Nzinga. What was the experience of the slave trade, the Middle Passage and the slave trade like for African women? Well, to begin with, we have this notion of the triangular trade. The triangular trade began with Europeans selling manufactured goods, usually guns, rum, to tribal leaders in Africa. Then tribal leaders would give slaves in return for those goods to the Europeans. More so often, it was Europeans capturing innocent Africans to be used as slaves. From that point on, we have this era of the slaves traveling to the example of America. It could be somewhere else. This is known as, I'm just going to put MP, the Middle Passage, which I'm going to lecture about in a little bit. The Middle Passage was the time period in which the Europeans transported over the ocean the slaves. They would then land, we're using the example of North America, in which the slaves would be auctioned as if they were, animal or cattle, in exchange for some sort of raw material, and then that would be transported back to the homeland of Europe. In the map, there's all different types of triangular slave trades that occurred. The Middle Passage, if you can look at these ink blots, these are all humans. These are all, look at this, look at row after row. They're put in there like sardines. These are all African men, women, and children that were enslaved and put usually in the hull of the boat, the bottom of the boat, and they were just stacked in there, laying down, again, like they were crowded in like sardines. Treatment, horrible, sick, disgusting, depraved treatment of these people. They were treated like they weren't even people. Again, that concept of the Europeans seeing themselves as superior, as better than them. The Africans were viewed by the Europeans as savages. Okay? This will be illustrated more so, instead of me lecturing any more about this, you're going to see this very vividly in the YouTube clip, and I'm gonna go to it in a second, the YouTube clip from the movie Amistad. So let me go to that now. For some reason I had trouble trying to add the link in so that you could just click it. So just take this, copy and paste it into the web page and watch it. It's only 8 minutes, it's not that long. I want to warn you, it's very graphic, it's very disturbing, but it is going to be a centerpiece for our discussion board about the experience for African women that were enslaved during the Middle Passage. So as you watch the clip, and I will give you the clip somewhere else in the discussion board so you can access it again, take notes of the different experiences of the women and what they went through, and the men as well. But of course, our focus is kind of more so on the history of women. So take note of some of the things you see that the European captors did to these enslaved women, and what that must have been like for them. Okay, so thank you so much. This ends our lecture, and our 2 discussion boards are going to kind of wrap up the whole entire lecture and the concepts that we went over. But the main point of this chapter was to see, and you can look at the learning objectives as well, but to see this period of colonization, the effects of colonization. We spent time on the multicultural perspective, Iroquois women, different Native American women experiences, the experiences of conquered women by these Europeans. That was a major focus. And then the other focus being that of female monarchs. Okay, thank you, and that concludes our lecture.